I smelled the smoke before I saw the flames. It was late, probably around 2 in the morning, when the acrid scent of burning would jerked me awake. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then my bedroom filled with a thick, suffocating haze. My heart pounded as I threw back the covers and ran to the window. What I saw made my stomach drop. My home was on fire. I stumbled out of my room, coughing, barely able to see through the smoke. I grabbed my phone, my purse, and my dog, Max, before tearing out the front door. That was when I noticed them. A group of people stood at the edge of my property, watching the fire with arms crossed. Among them, I spotted her, Margaret Winters, the president of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. Her perfectly manicured hands were folded neatly in front of her as she observed the destruction with an expression that was far too calm for someone witnessing a house fire. "Margaret," I choked on the smoke as I ran toward her. "Did you call the fire department?" She tilted her head, her blonde bob barely moving. "Wendy," she said smoothly, her voice carrying an air of practiced patience. "Your house was not in compliance with HOA regulations." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process her words over the roaring flames behind me. "What?" Margaret sighed as if she were dealing with a particularly slow child. "You received multiple notices about your fence being 2 inches taller than permitted. We also informed you that your front door color was unapproved. You ignored our warnings." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you saying the HOA did this?" I gestured wildly to the inferno that had been my home. Margaret didn't look the least bit concerned. "The board decided drastic measures were necessary for the integrity of the neighborhood." My hands clenched into fists. "You set my house on fire?" Margaret rolled her eyes. "Oh, Wendy, don't be dramatic." Before I could lunge at her, sirens wailed in the distance. The fire department had finally arrived. I turned to see the trucks racing toward my street, red and blue lights flashing. When I looked back at Margaret, she was already walking away, her little group of HOA cronies following close behind. I wanted to scream, but I had bigger things to worry about. The fire department tried their best, but it was too late. My home was gone. As I stood there, watching the last embers smolder, a cold determination settled in my chest. Margaret and her HOA thought they could get away with this? They thought burning down my home was just another day of enforcing their ridiculous power? They had no idea who they were messing with. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The morning after the fire, I stood in front of the charred remains of my home with a blank expression. The fire had consumed everything, leaving behind only blackened wood and smoldering rubble. The air was still thick with the scent of ash, and every breath I took felt heavy. I wasn't in shock anymore. No, the numbness had burned away with the last embers. Now all that remained was fury. The fire marshal had already come and gone, taking notes and snapping pictures. He had confirmed what I already knew: the fire was no accident. There were multiple points of origin, meaning it had been deliberately set. That alone was enough to warrant an investigation, but I needed more than that. I needed evidence. I wasn't naive enough to think Margaret and her HOA lackeys had personally lit the match, but they had orchestrated this. They had stood there watching without lifting a single finger to help. That meant they had something to hide. I needed proof, and I knew exactly where to start. I spent the next few hours making calls. First, my lawyer. I'd worked with him before on a minor property dispute years ago, but this was a whole different level. When I explained the situation, I could hear the disbelief in his voice. He promised to start looking into any legal avenues immediately. Next, I reached out to my neighbors, the ones who weren't under the HOA's thumb. There were plenty of people in the community who despised Margaret and her board but kept their heads down to avoid trouble. After what happened to my house, though, fear wasn't going to keep them silent anymore. By noon, I had a small gathering of residents in my backyard, or what was left of it. They had seen what happened, and they were furious. Margaret had been pushing her rules too far for years, but nobody had expected her to go this far. One of my neighbors, Peter, stepped forward. He was an older man, retired, with a sharp mind that had spent decades working in law enforcement. He had been at the scene the night before, watching from his porch. "She was too calm," Peter said grimly, his arms crossed. "I've seen a lot in my time, but I've never seen someone watch a house burn down like that without an ounce of concern." I nodded. She knew what was happening. She probably arranged for it. Another neighbor, Maria, spoke up. "I have security cameras." The entire group turned to her. Maria nodded. "I live right across the street. My cameras caught everything." I already pulled the footage. She handed me a USB drive and my hands tightened around it. If the cameras had caught anything suspicious anyone near my house before the fire started, then I had something concrete. I wasted no time. I borrowed Peter's laptop and plugged the drive in. The footage was grainy at night, but it was clear enough. At around midnight, a black SUV pulled up to my house. 3 figures got out, all dressed in dark clothing. They moved with purpose, carrying something containers, most likely gasoline. They disappeared around the side of my house. 15 minutes later, flames erupted. And then, minutes after that, Margaret arrived, standing with her arms crossed, watching. That was all I needed. I turned to Peter. Think this is enough to get the cops involved? His expression was grim. It's more than enough. By that evening, I was sitting in the local police station, speaking to a detective. He took the USB drive and watched the footage in silence. When it ended, he let out a long breath. This is bad, he admitted. Arson, conspiracy. If we can link this to the HOA, it's going to unravel fast. I leaned forward. Then start pulling the thread. The next few days were a whirlwind. The police launched an official investigation. The footage was enough to get a warrant for the HOA's financial records, and what they found was worse than I had imagined. Margaret and her board had been embezzling funds for years, using HOA fees to fund personal expenses. Lavish vacations, expensive renovations on their homes, even private security. Meanwhile, they had been harassing residents with fines and threats to keep them compliant. The fire was just the final straw. When the police confronted Margaret, she didn't even try to deny it at first. She scoffed, acting as though the whole thing was beneath her. But when the charges started stacking up: arson, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, her confidence started to crack. By the time the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the entire neighborhood had gathered outside the HOA office, watching. Margaret was led past them, her face pale. The same people she had bullied and controlled for years now stared at her with contempt. And then, just to twist the knife, Peter spoke up from the crowd. You should have just left Wendy alone. Margaret turned her head sharply, her eyes locking onto me. There was no more arrogance in her expression, just the realization that she had lost. For good. The HOA was done. The state launched a full investigation into its practices, and within weeks, it was officially dissolved. The remaining board members scattered, trying to avoid legal trouble. But they wouldn't escape it. Not after what they had done. As for me, I wasn't just going to rebuild my house. I was going to rebuild this community. Without the HOA, people were free to make their own choices again. No more arbitrary fines, no more ridiculous rules. And most importantly, no more Margaret. Justice had been served. With Margaret in handcuffs and the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter. The tension that had gripped the community for years slowly dissipating. People began talking to each other more freely, no longer worried about being tattled on for minor infractions. But my fight wasn't over. My home was still a pile of ash, and Margaret and her cronies had left behind a financial disaster. The HOA's bank records painted a grim picture: thousands of dollars siphoned away into personal accounts, while supposed community improvement funds had been misallocated or outright stolen. Residents who had been fined into submission were now realizing they had been victims of an elaborate scam. As I stood in what used to be my front yard, Peter joined me, hands in his pockets. The state's looking into restitution, he said. With the charges stacking up against Margaret and the others, they're going to have to cough up what they stole. That was something, but it wasn't enough. I needed my home back. I spent the next few days navigating the insurance nightmare. The adjusters were hesitant at first. Arson cases always raised red flags, but the footage Maria had captured, along with the police investigation, left no doubt that this was an intentional act. After a series of exhausting calls, my claim was approved. One evening, as I sat on the porch of Peter's house, he kindly offered me a place to stay while I figured things out. Maria arrived carrying a folder filled with documents. I've been digging, she said, setting it down on the table between us. Turns out Margaret and her group weren't just mismanaging funds. They were manipulating zoning laws to profit off homeowners. I flipped through the papers. Some of the documents showed falsified code violations, others were letters of intent from developers. It all pointed to one conclusion: Margaret and the HOA had been systematically forcing people out of their homes, issuing bogus fines, and then pressuring them to sell below market value. Once they had enough properties under their control, they planned to rezone and sell to a developer for a massive profit. I clenched my jaw. They were trying to drive me out. Peter nodded. And they did it to plenty of others before you. But they got greedy. Burning down your house was their biggest mistake. I took a deep breath, steadying my thoughts. We need to make sure everyone who was hurt by this gets compensated. Not just me. Maria smiled. That's why I brought this to you. I want to help. With the evidence in hand, I reached out to an attorney specializing in real estate fraud. A class action lawsuit was the next step, and as word spread, more residents came forward with their own horror stories, fabricated violations, unexplained fees, even intimidation tactics. Meanwhile, Margaret and the former board members were facing their own legal problems. The arson investigation had led to a deeper probe into their activities, and the state had frozen their assets. It wasn't long before they started turning on each other, trying to cut deals to reduce their sentences. One by one, they fell. Margaret, once so smug and untouchable, was now facing serious prison time. The developer who had been in on the scheme had his license revoked, and the properties that had been unlawfully seized were returned to their rightful owners. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood took on a new life. People started repainting their homes in whatever colors they wanted. Gardens flourished without fear of petty fines. The once hostile atmosphere had transformed into something much more welcoming. And as for me, my house was being rebuilt better than before. The community came together to help whenever they could, whether it was offering labor, supplies, or just moral support. One evening, as I watched the framework of my new home go up, Peter sat beside me, a small grin playing on his face. You started something big, Wendy. I exhaled, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. I just wanted my life back. Turns out a lot of people did. Maria joined us, holding a cup of coffee. We should throw a party once your house is finished. A real celebration. No HOA restrictions, no ridiculous permits, just neighbors enjoying themselves. I smiled. I'd like that. Justice had been served, the neighborhood was free, and Margaret's reign of terror was nothing more than a bad memory. And for the first time in a long while, everything felt right. The day the lawsuit officially moved forward, I stood in front of what would soon be my rebuilt home, watching as workers pieced together the framework. The rhythmic hammering and clatter of construction filled the air, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had once loomed over the ruins. The neighborhood was alive again, though this time with a renewed sense of freedom. The lawsuit had gained traction fast. The evidence of fraud and arson had been more than enough to dismantle the HOA, but now we were going after every last cent Margaret and her cronies had stolen. The legal team I had assembled was ruthless, ensuring that no loophole would allow them to escape accountability. Peter had taken on the role of unofficial investigator, digging through public records and uncovering more dirt on the corrupt board members. What we had initially thought was just financial manipulation turned out to be far worse. Margaret and her inner circle had been involved in fraudulent land grabs, pressuring elderly homeowners into selling their properties for a fraction of their value. Some had been driven out through fabricated violations, while others had been outright lied to about non-existent zoning changes. The more we uncovered, the clearer it became that this had been a long-running operation. Margaret wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president, she was a con artist who had spent years bleeding this community dry. And now she was paying the price. The state had frozen her assets, and her lawyers were scrambling to keep up with the flood of lawsuits pouring in. But the most satisfying part? She was still sitting in a jail cell waiting for her trial. That evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, I could see the transformation happening before my eyes. Homes that had once been forced into dull, uniform colors were now vibrant with fresh coats of paint. Driveways that had been cracked and neglected due to HOA restrictions were finally being repaired. People were out on their porches, chatting freely without the fear of an overzealous board member issuing fines for imaginary infractions. I stopped in front of Maria's house, where a small group of residents had gathered. They were reviewing paperwork, discussing how to ensure that the new community association, one run by the residents themselves, would never fall into the same trap as the HOA. Maria waved me over, and I joined them at the table. The discussion was focused on drafting new policies that would prevent any one person from gaining too much control. Decisions would be made collectively with full transparency. Peter leaned over, pointing at a clause in the document. He had been instrumental in ensuring that legal safeguards were in place. The new community association wouldn't have the power to issue arbitrary fines or impose unnecessary restrictions. Instead, it would function purely as a resource for residents offering assistance rather than punishment. As the conversation continued, I realized just how much things had changed. A few months ago, this neighborhood had been ruled by fear. Now, it was a place where people actually had a say in what happened to their own homes. The lawsuit was still ongoing, but the community had already won in the most important way. Margaret and her corrupt board had been stripped of their power, and the neighborhood was finally free. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the street, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The fight had been long and brutal, but it had been worth it. And as I looked around at my neighbors, now friends, I knew that we would never let anyone take the freedom away again. The legal battle was moving faster than anyone expected. With overwhelming evidence against Margaret and the former HOA board, the lawsuit was gaining serious momentum. The court had already ruled in favor of freezing their assets, and the state's attorney had begun preparing criminal charges beyond just arson and fraud. Every day, new victims of their scheme were coming forward, adding more weight to the case. In the meantime, the neighborhood was undergoing a transformation. Without the HOA dictating what people could or couldn't do, homeowners had started taking back control of their properties. Some were repainting their homes in colors that had long been banned, while others were finally making long overdue renovations that had been stalled for years due to the HOA's impossible restrictions. I had been focusing on rebuilding my own home, but I also made sure to stay involved in the legal proceedings. Peter, having spent years in law enforcement, had taken the lead in coordinating with investigators, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. Maria had been working with residents to document every instance of fraud, coercion, and financial manipulation that had taken place under Margaret's rule. One afternoon, I sat on the porch of Peter's house, reviewing a stack of legal documents. My lawyer had sent over the latest updates on the case, and the news was promising. The former HOA board members were starting to turn on each other, each one trying to cut a deal to avoid the harshest penalties. Margaret, however, was still refusing to cooperate. Peter sat across from me, sipping a cup of coffee. He had been keeping tabs on the investigation, and he had just returned from a meeting with the state's legal team. He set his cup down and leaned forward. "They're pushing for the harshest possible charges," he said. "The evidence is too strong for them to ignore. The state wants to make an example out of her." I nodded, flipping through the documents. Good. She didn't just ruin people's lives, she tried to erase them. She thought she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. Maria arrived a few minutes later, carrying another folder filled with new statements from residents. She placed it on the table and took a seat. "More people are coming forward," she said. "Some of them were too scared before, but now that the HOA is gone, they're finally speaking up." Peter opened the folder and scanned the statements. "This is going to bury her," he muttered. "There's no way she walks away from this." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. The fight had been exhausting, but it was finally paying off. The community was coming together in a way that I had never seen before. People who had once been isolated by fear were now standing side by side, determined to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. The lawsuit was scheduled to go to trial in a few weeks, but the criminal case was moving even faster. Investigators had uncovered a trail of financial fraud stretching back years, and it was clear that Margaret hadn't been acting alone. Several of the former board members had been implicated in the scheme, and warrants had already been issued for their arrests. One evening, as I was reviewing some final paperwork, Peter received a phone call. He listened for a moment before standing up abruptly. His expression was serious. "That was the state attorney's office," he said. "Margaret just tried to flee the country." Maria's eyes widened. "You're kidding." Peter shook his head. "She was caught at the airport with a fake passport and a suitcase full of cash. She was trying to get to South America." I wasn't surprised. Margaret had never been the kind of person to accept responsibility for her actions. She had spent years manipulating people and bending the rules to her advantage. The moment she realized she couldn't win, she had tried to run. "She's done," I said. "There's no way they'll let her off easy now." Peter nodded. "This just added more charges to the list. She's looking at serious prison time." The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. People were relieved, but they were also angry. Margaret had spent years terrorizing them, and now that she was finally facing justice, she had tried to escape. The trial date arrived faster than I expected. The courtroom was packed with residents, all eager to see justice served. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, looking far less composed than usual. Gone was the smug confidence that had once defined her. Instead, she looked pale, her hands clasped tightly together. The prosecution laid out the case with precision, presenting evidence of financial fraud, falsified violations, and, of course, arson. Witness after witness took the stand, describing how Margaret and the HOA had systematically abused their power. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with steady steps. I recounted everything: the bogus fines, the threats, the fire. I described how I had stood outside, watching my home burn, while Margaret and her cronies had simply observed with indifference. As I spoke, Margaret refused to meet my eyes. The trial lasted several days, but the verdict was never really in doubt. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their decision. Guilty. Margaret was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and the former board members who had been involved in the scheme received their own punishments. The restitution funds were established, ensuring that every resident who had been financially harmed would be compensated. As I walked out of the courthouse, Peter and Maria beside me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: closure. The fight was finally over. The neighborhood was free from the HOA's grip, and Margaret would never be able to manipulate or harm anyone again. The residents had taken back control of their community, and in doing so, they had built something stronger than any corrupt organization could ever hope to destroy. As I stood outside, looking at the faces of my neighbors, people who had once been afraid to speak out, but had now found their voices, I knew that the real victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in the community we had rebuilt together. The weeks following the trial were filled with a kind of quiet relief. Without Margaret and her corrupt board controlling every aspect of the neighborhood, things had settled into a new rhythm. People who had once avoided eye contact with their neighbors were now stopping to chat in their driveways. Families had started making repairs and changes to their homes without the fear of receiving a fine in the mail. The entire community felt different, lighter, freer. I had been busy overseeing the final stages of my home's reconstruction. The insurance payout covered most of the costs, but what really made a difference was the outpouring of support from my neighbors. People volunteered their time, donated materials, and even helped with landscaping. It was a level of generosity I hadn't expected, and it made it clear that, despite everything, this community had always been about more than just houses and property values. It had been Margaret and her board that had turned it into a battleground. Peter had been keeping an eye on the legal proceedings tied to the former HOA members, and every time we met up, he had new updates. The state had moved quickly, ensuring that restitution funds were distributed to those who had been financially harmed by the HOA's fraudulent actions. Several of Margaret's closest allies had also been convicted, their assets seized to compensate the victims. One evening, as I walked through the neighborhood, I saw Maria sitting on her porch, sorting through a stack of paperwork. She waved me over, and I took a seat beside her. She had been helping organize the new resident-led association, which operated solely as a resource for homeowners rather than an enforcement body. The idea was simple: help each other, not control each other. She handed me a document outlining the final dissolution of the HOA's legal entity. It was official. The Oak Ridge HOA no longer existed in any capacity. The properties and funds they had controlled had been redistributed, and the last of their influence had been erased from the community. Maria leaned back, stretching her arms. I could tell she was exhausted but satisfied. It had been a long battle, but the outcome had been worth every moment of effort. Peter walked up a few moments later, carrying a folder of his own. He had been working with legal experts to ensure that no loopholes could ever allow an HOA like Margaret's to form again in the neighborhood. He set the folder down and flipped it open, showing detailed changes to the local property agreement's clauses that prevented any future HOA from taking control. I read through the documents carefully, nodding. This was what true victory looked like: not just winning the legal battle, but ensuring that no one else could ever go through what we had endured. Peter pointed to one of the final clauses in the agreement, explaining that it required a unanimous vote by homeowners to approve any structural governance changes in the neighborhood. No more secret meetings, no more hidden agendas. Everything would be transparent, with every resident having an equal say in decisions. Maria added that several nearby communities had reached out, asking how we had managed to dismantle our HOA. Apparently, word had spread about what had happened, and other neighborhoods, trapped in similar situations, wanted to know how they could do the same. It was strange to think that what had started as a personal fight for justice had become something bigger. Our victory wasn't just about reclaiming our neighborhood, it was inspiring others to take action against their own corrupt HOAs. A few weeks later, my house was finally complete. The day I moved back in, the entire neighborhood came together for a small celebration. Maria had organized it, and Peter had made sure it was a real community effort. People brought food, music played, and kids ran around freely. As I stood on my new porch, looking out at the people who had fought alongside me, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. Not just relief that the battle was over, but a deep, satisfying sense of justice. Margaret had thought she could destroy my home and get away with it. She had believed that the HOA's power was untouchable, that she could bend the rules to her will without consequence. But she had underestimated me. She had underestimated all of us. Now, she was sitting in prison, her empire in ruins, while the neighborhood she had tried to control was thriving without her. As the evening wore on, Maria raised a glass in a toast. She spoke about how far we had come, how we had turned a nightmare into a fresh start. People cheered, and for the first time in a long time, I truly felt at home. No more HOA, no more fear. Just a community finally free.